Hey, it's Luke Johnson and Jennifer Avery from Noetic, the humanities teaching platform. You can go beta test it over at noetic.online, and you can download some proto version of the app. I have so much work to do. I'm going to let Jennifer take over. What are we talking about today, Jennifer?
Okay, well, we are on chapter 2 of volume the 3rd of Pride and Prejudice, and Lizzie has been in Derbyshire with her aunt and uncle, and they went to Pemberley to visit the estate as they did back in those days, and they ran into Mr. Darcy there. And Mr. Darcy asked Elizabeth if he could introduce her to his sister. And so that's pretty much where we left off. And Lizzie has begun to kind of rethink her attitude toward Mr. Darcy and to rethink what she thinks about him, because he's being much kinder and more pleasant than he has been in the past. And she's still kind of, her mind's still kind of boggled by this. And that doesn't help matters in chapter 2, when Lizzie and her aunt and uncle are hanging out at the inn where they're staying near Pemberley, and she's expecting Mr. Darcy to bring Miss Darcy to introduce them maybe the day after she gets there. And that was kind of usually how things went. Like, you would know that somebody was coming and you would expect to be introduced to them, but you say, oh, well, they're going to go home and rest and take care of business, and then they'll come see me because I'm not that important. But she is amazed when Mr. Darcy shows up with his sister the very day that his sister arrives in town. And so the Mr. and Mrs. Gardner and Lizzie are all sitting in the inn, and they see Mr. Darcy's carriage coming up, and there's like, oh, wow, he's actually bringing her now to meet Lizzie. And Mr. and Mrs. Gardner, Lizzie's aunt and uncle, are beginning to kind of think, well, if he's bringing her so soon after she arrives, then he must really think well of Lizzie. So maybe there's something going on there that we didn't know about. And they had pretty much decided on this when in they come. And now remember that Mr. Wickham has told Lizzie, and she has heard from other people in town, that Miss Darcy is considered very proud and maybe isn't the most pleasant person. But upon meeting Georgiana Darcy, Lizzie figures out pretty much right away that Miss Darcy isn't proud. Georgiana's not proud. She's not uppity. She's just really shy. And this is a really good observation, because a lot of people who are introverted like that, I think we've discussed how Mr. Darcy is kind of introverted. Georgiana is no different. And people who are introverted are often thought of as being kind of uppity because they don't talk much. And that's kind of what's been happening here. And Lizzie finds out that that's not the case pretty much right away. And so she immediately takes a shine to Miss Darcy. And throughout the conversation between the Gardners and the Darcys and Lizzie, everybody kind of begins to get this sense that Mr. Darcy really might have a thing for Lizzie. And in the middle of all of this, Mr. Bingley shows up. And remember, Mr. Bingley was the feller that they thought that Jane would be married to, but of course that didn't happen. But Mr. Bingley shows up, and Lizzie and Lizzie's pretty genuine when she says that she's happy to see him. And the way that she describes it is when Mr. Bingley comes in, all Elizabeth's anger against him had been long done away, but had she still felt any, it could hardly have stood its ground against the unaffected cordiality with which he expressed himself on seeing her again. He inquired in a friendly excuse me. He inquired in a friendly though general way after her family, and looked and spoke with the same good-humored ease as he had ever done. And and they go on a little bit about what Mr. and Mrs. Gardner are thinking about all of this. To Mr. and Mrs. Gardner, he was scarcely a less interesting personage than to herself. They had long wished to see him. The whole party before them, indeed, excited a lively attention. The suspicions which had just arisen of Mr. Darcy and their niece directed their observation towards each with an earnest though guarded inquiry, and they soon drew from these inquiries the full conviction that one of them at least knew what it was to love. Of the lady's sensations they remained a little in doubt, but that the gentleman was overflowing with admiration was evident enough. So Mr. and Mrs. Gardner, through watching this whole thing kind of unfold, are more and more convinced that Mr. Darcy really has a thing for Lizzie. They don't know if Lizzie's got a thing for him yet, but they know that Darcy's interested. And so, but in any case, let me see here. Okay, so basically they have this really pleasant visit with everybody, and by and by, okay, well, first let me mention this. With Bingley there, Lizzie is real obviously wants to find out kind of what he's thinking about Jane. And although he doesn't really say, and although he doesn't ask specifically about Jane, it becomes obvious that he's thinking about her. Because first of all, Lizzie notices that between Bingley and Mr. Darcy, remember that Bingley's sisters were kind of hoping that he would marry Georgia Darcy. But Lizzie sees that they don't really seem to have any particular interest in each other. And so that's immediately done away with. And Lizzie knows, okay, well, he doesn't really like Georgiana Darcy that much. And then Mr. Bingley asks, they kind of make a comment about how long it's been since they've seen each other. And Mr. Bingley names the exact date of the last time they saw each other. And the exact date. And so that is obvious that he is thinking very much of that night at Netherfield when they had the ball. And if you remember, the ball was where it became obvious that Bingley and Jane were kind of hooking up, as it were, or as much as people hooked up back in those days. But in any case, he remembers the exact date, and then he asks, well, are all of your sisters still at home? Are all of them still at home? And so he's asking about Jane without asking about Jane. and Lizzie picks up on that immediately. So she's satisfied, yeah, Bingley still got a thing for Jane. So that makes her feel better. And then she starts to feel better about Darcy because he's being really nice and cordial and actually talking to his her aunt and uncle, who he had actually protested about when he asked her to marry him the first time. And he's like, oh, well, your connections are so low. But even though he said that before, now he's treating Mr. and Mrs. Gardner, who he regarded as being beneath him before, he's now treating them very, very kindly. And it's not just like, it's not like what's the word I'm looking for? Oh my goodness. But it's not false. It's not just like a placating thing. He's actually interested in them and what they have to say. And that becomes obvious to Lizzie, too. And by the end of all of this pleasant conversation, all this nice visiting with each other, Darcy encourages Georgiana to invite the Gardners and Lizzie to Pemberley to have dinner with them, which it would have been, especially in this area of the country where the Darcy family pretty much ruled everything, this would have been considered an extreme honor for somebody in Lizzie's place to have been invited to Pemberley. And so they're invited to have dinner at Pemberley. And that's pretty much the deciding factor for the Gardners. Like, this is a nice guy, and it also makes an impression on Lizzie. Okay, well, okay, we're cool now then. So we're gonna have dinner. And the Gardners again are more and more convinced that not to believe what Wickham said, but to believe what the housekeeper said about Darcy, about how he's a nice guy. But in any case, and all of this kind of makes Lizzie really she was already reconsidering her feelings, but now she's really reconsidering them. Like, she's thinking, now, I might actually want to marry this dude now, which would have been impossible for her to consider only months before. And so, and here's a little bit about what Lizzie's thinking about all of this. Above all, above respect and esteem, there was a motive within her of goodwill, which could not be overlooked. It was gratitude. Gratitude not merely for having once loved her, but for loving her still well enough to forgive all the petulance and acrimony of her manner in rejecting him, and all the unjust accusations accompanying her rejection. He who, she had been persuaded, would avoid her as his greatest enemy, seemed on this accidental meeting most eager to preserve the acquaintance, and without any indelicate display of regard, or any peculiarity of manner, where their two selves only were concerned, was soliciting the good opinion of her friends, and bent on making her known to his sister. Such a change in a man of so much pride excited not only astonishment but gratitude, for to love, ardent love, it must be attributed, and as such its impression on her was of a sort to be encouraged, as by no means unpleasing, though it could not be exactly defined. She respected, she esteemed, she was grateful to him. She felt a real interest in his welfare, and she only wanted to know how far she wished that welfare to depend upon herself, and how far it would be for the happiness of both that she should employ the power, which her fancy told her she still possessed, of bringing on the renewal of his addresses. So this is a big deal here. Sorry. This is a big deal here. Lizzie is now, she's grateful. She's grateful that he actually cared enough about her to ask her to marry her. And now he's proving it even more by wanting to know her relatives, and by wanting his relatives to know her. And all of this kind of begins to make her see, you know what, I might actually need to try to kind of encourage him now. I might actually want to encourage him now, because it's pretty obvious that this dude has a thing for me, and so I'm not going to balk. I'm going to let it happen. And that's pretty much her decision here. And so this is where Lizzie goes from not thinking about Darcy at all as far as marrying him to actually encouraging the idea of marrying him. Okay? And so that's pretty much how that chapter ends. And chapter 3, they decide, Mr. and Mrs. Gardner and Lizzie decide to go repay Georgiana Darcy's call. So they go to Pemberley. And again, this was common practice. If somebody calls on you, like they come to your house and chat with you for a little while, it's proper etiquette to return the call within a certain amount of time, and to go see them and talk to them for a little while. And that's what they're doing here, is they're returning the call. And so Elizabeth and Mrs. Gardner go to Pemberley to hang out with Miss Darcy. And of course, who else is there? All the men. The men are out doing their thing. Mr. Gardner goes fishing with the other men. And so it's only the women that are hanging out here. It's Lizzie and Georgiana Darcy and Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst, who are Bingley's sisters. And if you recall, Miss Bingley is kind of a shrew. She's a kind of a manipulative, spiteful lady who does everything she can to undermine Lizzie. And during this visit's no different, but they do have like a little visit, and she's talking to Georgiana Darcy, and they're getting along really well. And Miss Darcy's a little bit shy, and she's not used to hosting, but Mrs. Gardner and Lizzie are trying to help her out and be kind to her and understanding that this is unusual for Georgiana Darcy, and she's shy. She doesn't really know how to go about it yet. And the Bingleys are not really helping her at all. The Bingley sisters aren't. But Elizabeth soon saw that she was herself closely watched by Miss Bingley, and that she could not speak a word, especially to Miss Darcy, without calling her attention. So Miss Bingley is watching Lizzie like a hawk, as she always does. And the fact that that Mr. Darcy brought Lizzie, brought Georgiana to see Lizzie when she had just gotten home, would not have been lost to these women. So Miss Bingley is really worried now because she wants to marry Darcy, and she's looking down her nose at Lizzie and her entire family. And so she wants to undermine her and just kind of destroy this whole idea of Darcy and Lizzie. And but in any case, so the ladies kind of have a little bit of conversation. They're hanging out, and then in come the gentlemen. Excuse me. The men come in. They don't really okay, so no sooner did he appear, and that is Mr. Darcy, then Elizabeth wisely resolved to be perfectly easy and unembarrassed, a resolution the more necessary to be made, but perhaps not the more easily kept, because she saw that the suspicions of the whole party were awakened against them, and that there was scarcely an eye which did not watch his behavior when he first came into the room. In no countenance was attentive curiosity so strongly marked as in Miss Bingley's, in spite of the smiles which overspread her face whenever she spoke to one of its objects, for jealousy had not yet made her desperate, and her attentions to Mr. Darcy were by no means over. Miss Darcy, on her brother's entrance, exerted herself much more to talk, and Elizabeth saw that he was anxious for his sister and herself to get acquainted, and forwarded as much as possible every attempt at conversation on either side. Miss Bingley saw all this likewise, and in the imprudence of anger, took the first opportunity of saying with sneering civility, "Pray, Miss Eliza, are not the Blankshire militia removed from Meryton? They must be a great loss to your family." So this is like kind of stuff here, okay? Because Miss Bingley sees this. She sees that Mr. Darcy wants Georgiana and Lizzie to get along well, because if they get married, they're going to have to get along well. And so he's trying his best to make sure that happens. Miss Bingley sees this, and it makes her mad. It makes her mad, and it makes her jealous. And so that's why she says this catty thing to Lizzie. But here's the thing that she now admit it now. In her defense, Caroline Bingley does not know about Georgiana's past relationship with George Wickham. because Mr. Darcy kept all of this secret from all of his friends, and the only people who knew were Colonel Fitzwilliam and now Lizzie. And so she doesn't realize how mean this is, not only to Lizzie, but to Georgiana Darcy, because Georgiana Darcy knows that's where Wickham ended up. Okay? And so she sees that. All right, so she hears this, and Georgiana Darcy immediately stops talking. But Lizzie takes pity on her, and had Miss Bingley known what pain she was then giving her beloved friend, she undoubtedly would have refrained from the hint. But she had merely intended to discompose Elizabeth by bringing forward the idea of a man to whom she believed her partial, to make her betray a sensibility which might injure her in Darcy's opinion, and perhaps to remind the latter of all the follies and absurdities by which some part of her family were connected with that core. Not a syllable had ever reached her of Miss Darcy's meditated elopement. To no creature had it been revealed where secrecy was possible except to Elizabeth. And from all Bingley's connections, her brother was particularly anxious to conceal it, from that very wish which Elizabeth had long ago attributed to him of their becoming hereafter her own. He had certainly formed such a plan, and without meaning that it should affect his endeavour to separate him from Miss Bennet, it is probable that it might add something to his lively concern for the welfare of his friend. Elizabeth's collected behaviour, however, soon quieted his emotion, and as Miss Bingley, vexed and disappointed, dared not approach nearer to Wickham, Georgiana also recovered in time, though not enough to be able to speak any more. Her brother, whose eyes she feared to meet, scarcely recollected her interest in the affair, and the very circumstance which had been designed to turn his thoughts from Elizabeth seemed to have fixed them on her more and more cheerfully. So all that Miss Bingley has managed to do by that catty little comment is to make Mr. Darcy think more of Lizzie and less of Miss Bingley, which is generally how that happens when you have a catty woman trying to undermine another lady to a man. And that's usually what happens, especially if it's a smart man who is, not swayed by such things. But in any case, even now, she realizes that she didn't succeed here, but that doesn't mean that she's not going to try again. And after Lizzie and the Gardiners leave, Darcy walks them out, and then he comes back in. And as soon as Mr. Darcy comes back in, after he's walked them to the carriage, Miss Bingley starts again. "How very ill Eliza Bennet looks this morning, Mr. Darcy," she cried. "I never in my life saw anyone so much altered as she is since the winter. She has grown so brown and coarse. Louisa and I were agreeing that we should not have known her again." And you see, she's undermining her again. However little Mr. Darcy might have liked such an address, he contented himself with coolly replying that he perceived no other alteration than her being rather tanned. No miraculous consequence of travelling in the summer. "For my own part," she rejoined, "I must confess that I never could see any beauty in her. Her face is too thin, her complexion has no brilliancy, and her features are not at all handsome. Her nose wants character, there is nothing marked in its lines. Her teeth are tolerable, but not out of the common way. And as for her eyes, which have sometimes been called so fine, I could never perceive anything extraordinary in them. They have a sharp, shrewish look, which I do not like at all. And in her air altogether, there is a self-sufficiency without fashion, which is intolerable." You see what she's doing? She's catty woman behavior. She points out all these flaws, not in character, but in appearance. And that's where she fails. Because Darcy is not just thinking appearance, he's thinking beyond appearance. And Miss Bingley is thinking just appearance. Persuaded as Miss Bingley was that Darcy admired Elizabeth, this was not the best method of recommending herself. But angry people are not always wise, and in seeing him at last look somewhat nettled, she had all the success she expected. He was resolutely silent, however, and from a determination of making him speak, she continued. I remember when we first knew her at Hertfordshire, how amazed we all were to find that she was a reputed beauty, and I particularly recollect your saying one night, after they had been dining at Netherfield, she a beauty, I should as soon call her mother a wit. But afterwards she seemed to improve on you, and I believe you thought her rather pretty at one time. Yes, replied Darcy, who could contain himself no longer. But that was only when I first knew her, for it is many months since I have considered her as one of the handsomest women of my acquaintance. He then went away, and Miss Bingley was left to all the satisfaction of having forced him to say what gave no one any pain but herself. So basically, Miss Bingley goads Darcy into saying something that she's Miss Bingley is trying to get Darcy to say something about, yeah, I did for a little while, but I'm just trying to be nice to her or something like that. But what he actually says is, she's among the most handsome women of my acquaintance. That's a big oh snap moment right there. Okay, that's a big oh snap, because Miss Bingley is then pretty much put in her place. Like this is pretty much the last time we hear from her, because this pretty much shuts the door on Miss Bingley for good. And it's now obvious that Darcy is going to ask Lizzie to marry him. And that's where chapter 3 ends off. But of course, as all things in literature and in stories like this, stuff just don't work out. So, at least for the time being. So, in chapter 4, Elizabeth gets 2 letters from Jane. Okay, and she didn't get the first one sooner because Jane had written the address in such a way that it was misdirected, so that it didn't arrive at the right house at first, and then she had to wait for it to come to the right place. So Jane didn't write the address well, and we find out pretty soon why. So Lizzie reads this letter, the first letter. And the first letter, Jane tells her that Lydia, their youngest sister, who remember is kind of an idiot, has run off with George Wickham, who we know now is a scoundrel. And so Lydia, the letter says that Lydia went to Scotland with George Wickham. And what that means in any of these Regency novels, if you see somebody say they went to Scotland together or they went to Gretna Green, what that is during this time period, I believe it was in the 1850s or the 1750s, excuse me, there was a law passed in Parliament that required men and women under the age of 21 to get permission from their parents before they could get married. Now, this is in England. That law did not apply in Scotland. And so a lot of young men and women would go off to Scotland to get married if their parents didn't approve of it. And when you hear Gretna Green was the village closest to the English border in Scotland. And so that's where a lot of men and women would go to get married. And at Gretna Green, they actually started a business. It's basically like a Vegas kind of wedding thing, you know. Like Gretna Green was the Vegas of the UK in the Regency era. So Lydia has gone off to elope with George Wickham. Now this is bad enough, and Jane is hopeful. She's like, oh well, I'm sure we'll soon hear from Lydia that she's married now. But then poor Lizzie reads the second letter, and come to find out that Wickham and Lydia did not go to Scotland. They're going to London, which means that they don't mean to get married, which is an extreme scandal. Y'all don't even know the level of scandal this was back then. I mean, that means that they're traveling together without a chaperone. They are lodging together. They are living together. And they are not married. Oh my God. And this doesn't just damage the reputation of the girl who does it. It damages the reputation of the entire family. The entire family. Which is why this is so catastrophic. Is if Lydia is living with George Wickham and is not married, then nobody will ever want to marry the other women in the family. And so that means they are screwed. Or at least they think they are screwed. Which is why Jane begs Lizzie to get Mr. Gardner to come to London to help their father find out what's happened with Lydia and try to make them get married. Because the only way to repair this, even slightly repair it, and this is basically duct tape, okay? Because she's already lived with Wickham without being married, so they are forever tainted by just this. But if they can get Wickham to marry Lydia, then that will repair her reputation at least a little bit. She can be out in society. She, in Mansfield Park, for instance, one of the Bertram sisters runs off with Henry Crawford, and she's married to another man when she runs off with Crawford. And she can never show her face in public again. And if Lydia never marries Wickham, she could never show her face in public again. And neither could the rest of her family. Without being hissed at or, so it would have been seen as very vulgar to have shown up in public after something like that. But in any case, so Lizzie is freaking out. She's in tears, she's crying, and she's about to go off and look for the Gardners who are off somewhere else. And oh, bless her heart, here comes Mr. Darcy. And Darcy immediately sees that he immediately sees that Lizzie is out of sorts. Something's up with this girl. And so he sits her down and tries to kind of calm her down and see, do you want anything? Can I get you a glass of wine? And all of this. And poor Lizzie basically has to tell him the story, what has just happened. She has to tell Darcy, who has this huge standing in the community and in society, that her stupid little sister is living with this guy who he hates already, and and has basically ruined the whole family. She's got to tell him all this, and so she does. And he leaves not long after she tells him. And Lizzie immediately thinks, oh my Lord, I'm never going to hear from him again. Right after she's decided, I'm not going to say no if he asks me to marry him again, then she's thinking, okay, well, I'm never going to see him again now. Well, crap. well, I screwed that up, didn't I? You know? And, but in any case, Darcy goes off, and Lizzie's freaking out. And Lizzie is more than anything, really. Lizzie is feeling guilty about Lydia running off with Wickham because she didn't tell anybody what she knew about Wickham. She feels like if she had said something about it, then this couldn't have happened. And she says this to Darcy. But all Darcy can say is, I'm grieved, I'm shocked. He doesn't say, no, honey, it's not your fault, it's mine. He just says, I'm shocked, and then he leaves. And so she's immediately thinking, okay, well, I'm never going to see this guy again. And so she's freaking out, and she has sent the servant to go get Mr. and Mrs. Gardner. And in come the Gardners, and, oh, wait a minute, there was something. Okay, and here she begins to kind of wonder, and this could be a good paper to write, because it's kind of unclear. From this point on to the end of the book, it remains unclear as to why Wickham does this. And this is kind of the beginning of that, where Lizzie's trying to figure out how did this happen. Let's see, be that as it may, she saw him go with regret, and this is Darcy. And in this early example of what Lydia's infamy must produce, found additional anguish as she reflected on that wretched business. Never since reading Jane's second letter had she entertained a hope of Wickham's meaning to marry her. No one but Jane, she thought, could flatter herself with such an expectation. Surprise was the least of all her feelings on this development. While the contents of the first letter remained on her mind, she was all surprise, all astonishment, that Wickham should marry a girl whom it was impossible he could marry for money, and how Lydia could ever have attached him had appeared incomprehensible. But now it was all too natural. For such an attachment as this, she might have sufficient charms, and though she did not suppose Lydia to be deliberately engaging in an elopement without the intention of marriage, she had no difficulty in believing that neither her virtue nor her understanding would preserve her from falling an easy prey. So, so after she reads the first letter, she's like, why in the world would Wickham want to marry Lydia? He's not going to get any money from us. We don't have any good connections. And, he was engaged to this Mary King girl just because she inherited 30,000 pounds. So why would he want to marry Lydia? And when she says, but now it was all too natural. For such an attachment as this, she might have sufficient charms. So such an attachment as this would be that would be basically extramarital sex. Okay? They are, She's pretty much convinced that Wickham's basically using Lydia to have fun with her. And Lydia is good enough for that because she's pretty enough, and yeah, she's sweet and she's lively. And that's all. And that's pretty much all Lydia is. She's lively and she's pretty. That's it. And so she's like, and this just makes her feel worse. And so, because, so she is, poor Lizzie is just agonizing all of this. And then the Gardners show up and they get all their stuff together. And then they head out. And they head out to go to Longbourn to fix all this mess, or try to. And while they're in chapter 5, the Gardners kind of weigh in on what they think, and they're like, oh, well, and Chapter 5 is like, oh, well, maybe, Jane's right. Maybe this isn't so bad. Maybe Wickham really will want to marry. Maybe they're going to London so they can have a private wedding. Maybe it would be less expensive for them to get married in London or something. And so the Gardners are trying to make her feel better. But Lizzie is just kind of like, nope, I don't think so, y'all. She's being more cynical because she knows more about Wickham than the Gardners do. And, but in any case, they have a little bit of a discussion about, again, why would Wickham run off with Lydia and not marry her? Why would Wickham run off with Lydia and marry her or not marry her? And why, in general, would Wickham want to run off with Lydia? So the Gardners are saying, well, Jane doesn't think this is going, Jane doesn't think it's going to be so bad. And then Lizzie says, of whom does Jane ever think ill? And who is there, whatever there might be their former conduct, that she would believe capable of such an attempt till it were proved against them? But Jane knows, as well as I do, what Wickham really is. And we both know that he has been profligate in every sense of the word, that he has neither integrity nor honor, that he is as false and deceitful as he is insinuating. And Mrs. Gardner's like, what? How do you know this? And then she tells the Gardners about everything having to do with Wickham except the part about Georgiana Darcy, because Mr. Darcy didn't want her to say anything, and she's honoring her promise. She doesn't tell him about Georgiana Darcy. She tells them about what he did to Darcy as far as asking for money instead of the living, and then kind of downing Darcy and all of that. And so she tells them the whole thing, and the Gardners are like, holy crap, really? But does Lydia know this? And this makes Lizzie even more upset, because like, well, no, Lydia doesn't, because I didn't tell anybody, because I'm an idiot. It's like, why didn't I tell anybody about this? Why didn't I think about it? But again, she's like, well, how could I have known that he would go after Lydia? Because there's no reason for him to go after Lydia. And so they're all still kind of in confusion about all of this. And they finally show up at Longbourn after all this conversation. And they stay a night on the road. And then they show up at Longbourn. And they show up at Longbourn. All they find is Mr. Bennet has gone to London to try to figure out what's going on. Mrs. Bennet is freaking out. But she's freaking out in her dumb way. She said, Mrs. Bennet, whose apartment they all repaired after a few minutes' conversation together, received them exactly as might be expected, with tears and lamentations of regret, invectives against the villainous conduct of Wickham, and complaints of her own sufferings and ill usage, blaming everybody but the person to whose ill-judging indulgence the errors of her daughter must be principally owing. So she's blaming everybody but herself. And it kind of is Mrs. Bennet's fault, because of the way she's always indulged Lydia and said, take every opportunity of enjoying herself, which is what she said right before Lydia left to go to Brighton. And so, but again, Mrs. Bennet's all fluttering and freaking out, and she's more concerned about the wedding clothes than the reputation of her daughters, or of her other daughters, and all of this is going on. After all of, they see Mrs. Bennet for a minute, and Mr. Gardner kind of tries to chill her out and say, I'm going to do everything I can to help out. And then Jane and Lizzie have about half an hour to themselves, and she gets more information from Jane about what has happened, about, you know, more details about how did all this go down, what was going on. And then Jane gives her a letter that Colonel Forster gave to the family that Lydia wrote to Mrs. Forster. And Lydia and her, and I'll just read this really quickly. My dear Harriet, you will laugh when you know where I am gone, and I cannot help laughing myself at your surprise tomorrow morning as soon as I am missed. I'm going to Gretna Green, and if you cannot guess with who, I shall think you a simpleton, for there is but one man in the world I love, and he is an angel. I should never be happy without him, so think it no harm to be off. You need not send them word at Longbourn of my going, if you do not like it, for it will make the surprise the greater when I write to them and sign my name Lydia Wickham. What a good joke it will be. I can hardly write for laughing. Pray make my excuses to Pratt for not keeping my engagement and dancing with him tonight. Tell him I hope he will excuse me when he knows all, and tell him I will dance with him at the next ball we meet with great pleasure. I shall send for my clothes when I get to Longbourn, but I wish you would tell Sally to mend a great slit in my worked muslin gown before they are packed up. Goodbye. Give my love to Colonel Forster. I hope you will drink to our good journey. This is what Lydia writes. At least she thinks that they're going to get married. So that makes them feel a little bit better. But they know she's stupid enough that Wickham could have persuaded her to go on to London. But she is more, and she doesn't even think about the implications of what she's doing here. She doesn't even, she even asked Colonel Forster to get her maid to fix one of her gowns before they pack them up for her and send them. Okay, this is ridiculous, and she's more concerned about not offending this other man, this other officer, who has asked her to dance at the next ball. Okay? This is how stupid Lydia is. She has no idea of what she has done. None whatsoever. And this just makes Lizzie mad. And, but she feels a little bit better. Okay, well, at least she thinks they're going to go get married. But anyway, this is pretty much. And then Jane tells her about the people who have come over to help them out. And Jane is exhausted because the other two sisters, Mary and Kitty, haven't been any help whatsoever to poor Jane. And Jane has been having to deal with their stupid mother the whole time and dealing with her freaking out. And Jane's freaking out herself. And the two other sisters are over here doing something else entirely, not even caring. And that's, and Lady Lucas and some other people in the town have come to offer their help. And that means that people outside the family know. And that's not good. Because they're trying to keep it quiet until they can get Lydia married to Wickham. But that proves to be impossible with their stupid mother. So, that's pretty much how that chapter ends, and that's where we can stop today. But in any case, just a quick recap. Poor Lizzie has just decided that she likes Mr. Darcy, and she might say yes if he asks her to marry him again. But then her stupid sister goes and destroys everybody's future by being an idiot. And it's all their mother's fault. So that's pretty much where we leave that. So,
well, thank you very much, Jennifer. Appreciate it as always. I'll have this audio edited as soon as I can. It'll probably be in the morning. Yeah. And I'll talk to you again next week. Thank you so much.